July 1945. The Second World War is still continuing. In New Mexico, American scientists are about to conduct a secret experiment. They know what should happen in theory. Now they'll see if it works in practice. Berlin Brixner is the team cameraman.
Pretty soon it was minutes before zero, then it was seconds, and my cameras turned on automatically, and then I looked through the viewfinder. I was looking straight at the bomb where it would explode. I saw the ball of fire rising, and then I realized I had to get to the panoramic controls of the camera and follow the bomb up, and then I did follow the ball of fire rising. It was surrounded by a luminous blue haze, a blue light, due to the high radioactivity.
With the first atomic explosion, the Americans now have the weapon they believe can end the fighting in the Pacific.
Well, I was so dumbfounded that I just sat there thinking about the fact that we had been successful in making the bomb, and that soon the World War II would be at an end because we would now use that bomb on Japan.
The forces first released here will never be put back. They promise a new age of scientific progress, but they also bring secrecy and fear, casting a shadow over the lives of millions for the rest of the century. The nuclear age began with an arms race conducted in deepest secrecy. The Americans built huge processing plants after 1940 in a desperate attempt to develop an atomic bomb before Germany. 78,000 worked at the biggest of the secret factories on a military reservation in Tennessee.
We had a sense that what we were doing was important, and it may indeed change things if we succeeded. And even though we did not know exactly, maybe some did, don't get me wrong, but the large portion of us did not know exactly what we were doing. But there was this sense that we were doing something that was important to the war effort. And if we succeeded, it would make a change.
With an eye to history, the project leaders later reconstructed for the cameras the moment when they produced an entirely new substance.
Here it is, General Groves, plutonium.
Well, that's the first I've ever seen. But after this, if you don't mind, I wish you'd hold something under it, because after all, there's about over $50 million in that tube.
Though the secret weapon had been built with Germany in mind, the war in Europe was now over. The bomb was to be used against Japan, still fighting on. 2 bombs were flown to the island of Tinian in the Pacific and prepared by a team from the Los Alamos laboratory. Harold Agnew was one of the young researchers.
When the bomb was being loaded, we had some felt marking pens. And most everybody involved had written their names on it with some nasty remarks for the emperor or Hirohito or whoever it was. And we usually put our families, you know, our wives' names, daughters' names, and just saying this is a present. We had an intense hatred It's the only way to describe it are the Japanese. Every week, 25,000 Chinese being killed. I don't know how many we were losing every week, and every day I think was crucial to ending the war.
Some scientists had misgivings, but the final decision to go ahead and use the weapon was taken in Washington. The target would be the port of Hiroshima. Harold Agnew flew as an observer.
21 days after the New Mexico experiment, a B-29 was over Hiroshima carrying an atomic bomb. At 8:15 in the morning of August 6th, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb struck an enemy target.
We did get a flash of light in the cabin, so we know it had gone off. And I know I wrote in my notebook, wow, it really went off, it really did.
"31,000 feet below, Akira Ishida was in a tram on his way to work in the center of Hiroshima.
I saw a bright flash. It was like lightning, a thunderbolt. It was so intense I was blinded for a second. I passed out immediately. When I came round, my brother and I realized that we were buried under the bodies of all the passengers on the tram who died when the bomb went off. We were suffocating.
The destruction was unlike anything before. In an instant, 71,000 people had died. The survivors had no idea of the new science and energy behind the weapon that had been used. All the passengers in Akira Ishida's tram were killed, except him and his brother. They started walking.
Sitting on stone steps covered by blackened debris was a woman. Her entire body was charred and her hair was completely burnt. She was embracing a red, burnt baby in her arms and trying to breastfeed it with her red, burnt nipples, calling the baby's name again and again.
3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and another 40,000 were killed in a moment. The heat and light gave horrific burns to all within 2.5 miles. It damaged the retina of the eye and raised lesions and blisters. The victims were filmed, though the pictures were kept secret for years. 16-year-old Sumitero Taniguchi was delivering letters on his bicycle at the time of the blast. The flash burn flayed the skin from his back.
After the bomb had gone off, I lay on my stomach, unable to move, for a year and 9 months, waiting for my wounds to heal. I suffered throughout. Nobody thought I would survive. Even the American cameraman and crew thought I was going to die.
In the weeks and months that followed, many who had no visible injuries sickened. They felt weak from what was soon recognized as the effect of radiation. Thousands more died. Others remained ill and would continue to suffer for years to come. The Japanese surrender 5 days after Nagasaki was a moment of intense relief for the Allies. Sheldon Johnson was a young GI from Utah serving in the Pacific.
I was in the Philippines ready to move on to Japan for an invasion, and when Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped, in a sense I thought, well, I feel bad that all those lives were lost, but it certainly saved mine because I would have been in an invasion force. And I thought the overall net effect was that it saved many, many lives, and it was a beautiful, great thing.
I believe the bomb that struck Hiroshima was the answer to our fighting boys' prayer.
It was a triumph. And at that moment in 1945, few foresaw how the bomb would bring a new arms race and unprecedented fear around the world. Others now wanted the bomb too. Fearful of America's new power, Joseph Stalin put his secret police chief, Lavrenti Beria, in charge of a Soviet drive to acquire a bomb at any cost. Starting in 1946, the Soviet Union built 10 secret cities, known as Atomgrads. Thousands of scientists and engineers were sent to work in them. After fighting in the Red Army, Arkady Brish was dispatched to an Atomgrad in the Urals.
There was a burning desire to make a powerful weapon of our own and catch up with the Americans. Starting in 1947, my colleagues and I worked night and day to develop the new science and master the technology.
The Soviet scientists were under intense pressure to deliver results. Beria's secret police were obsessed with the danger of spies.
We don't know why, but one of our team was banned from work, transferred to the library, then dismissed. When two colleagues in civilian dress, as we called them, came to arrest him, he went into a back room and shot himself.
By 1949, the Soviets had what they wanted. The atomic race was now on in earnest. The Americans worked to stay ahead.
From Las Vegas, America's legalized gambling center, Pathé cameramen secure exclusive pictures of secret atomic weapon tests at Frenchman's Flat, 75 miles away. Here goes the first one. "75 miles away, remember. Of 5 tested, this is the biggest."
In other tests, the generals practiced the military tactics that would be needed for the wars of the future. They planned to send ground troops onto the battlefield after a nuclear strike, and they wanted to know more about the physical effects on the soldiers. The Army and Marine Corps competed with each other, seeing how near they could get their men to a test blast.
You are here to participate in an atomic maneuver. This is not a haphazard maneuver. Careful planning for it started months back. Watched from a safe distance, this explosion is one of the most beautiful sights ever seen by man. You're probably saying, so it's beautiful. What makes it so dangerous? Radiation. This is the one new effect obtained by the use of an atomic weapon. Truthfully, it's the least important as far as the soldier on the ground is concerned. The radiation level may be high, but if you follow orders, you'll be moved out in time to avoid sickness. Finally, if you receive enough gamma radiation to cause sterility or severe sickness, you'll be killed by blast, flying debris, or heat anyway.
60,000 troops took part in standard uniforms without any special protection. Civilian scientists warned the soldiers were too close, but the generals went ahead anyway.
When we were brought here, a voice from an unseen loudspeaker said, "Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to the land of the giant mushrooms. You're going to be closer to a nuclear weapon or an atomic bomb than anyone since Hiroshima." It left a very eerie feeling at the time I heard that.
Tom Saffer had been in the Marines for just 4 months. He was 22.
We were told to kneel, put our forearms over our eyes, and close our eyes tightly. Then the countdown started. Our right shoulder was towards the blast. We were told not to look up, and none of us dare looked. Then the countdown started. 5, 4, 3. You heard a sharp click and this intense heat on the back of the exposed neck. And the most shocking part of this was you could see the 2 bones in your forearm in a bright red light. Within a few seconds, shock wave from the bomb hit these trenches, and I was immediately thrown from one side of the trench wall to the other. And I was frightened beyond belief. After the gyrating and the shaking stopped, we stood up and looked at the fireball escalating into the troposphere. Nobody said a word because we were all in a state of shock.
They were being used as guinea pigs, establishing what was possible.
The radiological safety person from the Army came up with a Geiger counter and put it over us, and you could hear it clicking, clicking. And then one man dusted us off with a broom, because the prevailing thought was, you get rid of the dust, you get rid of the radiation.
Though the tests were secret, there were small communities near enough to see what was going on. St. George, Utah was 150 miles across the desert. Residents watched the flashes on the horizon and worried when clouds of dust followed one bomb, later called Dirty Harry. The Atomic Energy Commission assured them the fallout was quite safe with a special film.
As this thriving community went about its business, youngsters on their way to school, housewives starting on the chores of the day, merchants opening their doors, and the folks at home listening to the radio program.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program to bring you important news. Word has just been received from the Atomic Energy Commission that due to a change in wind direction, the residue from this morning's atomic detonation is drifting in the direction of St. George. There is no danger.
1 hour and 50 minutes later, at 11:25 a.m., the all-clear announcement was broadcast. Actually, when the invisible cloud had passed, the total amount of radiation deposited on St. George was far from hazardous. Then you may ask, why were the people asked to stay indoors? For a very simple reason. The Atomic Energy Commission doesn't take chances on safety.
Sheldon Johnson believed the official reassurances. He'd come home to St. George from the war and married.
We felt in the 50s and 60s that atomic energy was the greatest thing that ever happened, and we were part of it, and it was just a blessing in our lives. And besides, more motels were filled by people coming through, and more cafes sold meals, and it was a prosperous thing, and we needed that kind of a boost in the economy. And so we thought the atomic testing was great for St. George at that time.
The International Conference on Peaceful Uses of Atomic Energy is the first of its kind ever held.
From the start, governments told their people that nuclear science could bring enormous benefits. 73 countries met at a conference.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma, to devote its entire heart and mind to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life.
People were promised the future could be brighter, cleaner, cheaper, and asked to marvel at the atom.
When did all this begin, Dad?
Well, son, it's a very old story. It's so old it's hard to say when it really began. Could have been back in 1540 when Copernicus identified the Earth as a speck of dust moving in an orbit around the sun. Or it could have been in 1905 when a young German physicist arrived at a fundamental truth, that matter could be converted into energy and expressed it in the equation E equals mc squared. Somewhere in the course of these events, the dawn came up on the atomic era. It's going to have a tremendous effect on our town down there, son. Not because we have a lot of heavy industry. That doesn't matter. It'll be felt in every town in America. And it won't matter if they make ships or shoes or sealing wax. The many uses of atomic energy now and in the future will change not only the things around us, our very way of life.
You know, I don't know what I'd do without my new kitchen. Really, it saves me hours of work every day. But do you suppose that our appliances would run as well on atomic energy?
The first country to feed electricity from an atomic power station into people's homes in 1956 was Britain.
For many years now, we have been aware that atomic scientists, by a series of brilliant discoveries, have brought us to the threshold of a new age. We have also known that on that threshold, mankind has reached a point of crisis. Today we are, in a sense, seeing a solution of that crisis, as this new power, which has proved itself to be such a terrifying weapon of destruction, is harnessed for the first time for the common good of our community.
The Queen then moved a lever, releasing atom power.
Governments concealed the fact that early power stations also made plutonium for bombs, for there was no slowdown in weapons research. A year after the Americans had built the more powerful H-bomb, the Soviets caught up.
И мы вызвали в мир кошмар ядерного оружия. Но во имя защиты социалистической революции, нашей свободы и процветания, мы в свое время до Московского договора 1963 года создали и испытали.
We must learn to live in a world where we have the hydrogen bomb and the enemy of freedom has the hydrogen bomb. It can destroy any city. That means Fort Worth and Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Amarillo, El Paso, yes, Johnson City.
As both sides ordered more warheads, they realized that each now had the ability to destroy the other and could, in turn, expect to be destroyed. Retaliation was guaranteed. This strategy was known as mutually assured destruction. MAD.
In the olden days, pre-nuclear weapons, the politicians could start a war, send out young people to kill each other, and nothing would happen to them. It was a no loss, so to speak, as far as their own lives or their families or their properties. With a nuclear weapon, everybody was at risk.
Both sides prepared for Armageddon.
Imperialism and madmen still exist, and their adventuristic plans threaten to plunge mankind into a new world war. The aggressor should bear in mind that If they start a war, the Soviet armed forces will retaliate with a swift, crushing blow.
It's an effective intercontinental nuclear air force, secure as we can make it within our resources. A sizable portion of it is secure from destruction by the enemy, regardless of what offensive and defensive action he takes against it. The size, composition, and alertness of the offense force is such that the enemy realizes that an attack on the United States would likely mean committing national suicide. Nobody wins in nuclear war because both sides are sure to suffer terrible damage.
In the Soviet Union, Europe, and America, citizens now lived in a heightened state of nuclear terror. Russian bus passengers were told what to do if attacked.
Товарищи, не волнуйтесь. Во время воздушной тревоги весь городской транспорт выходит за черту города, где жители будут в большей безопасности.
American school children were taught simple survival tips.
Diddle-dum-dum, there was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He'd duck and cover, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck, and then you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
In Britain, the government made complicated preparations for doomsday.
I'm going to explain the system of warning signals that are used in the event of a nuclear attack. You should be prepared to act. There are 4 warnings: the red, the grey, the black, and the all clear. Where sirens have not yet been provided, the grey warning may also be given by church bells, or in Scotland, where church bells are not in common use, by word of mouth or by whistle.
Because American bombers were based in Britain, the United Kingdom was expected to be the first target in Western Europe. It was reckoned 1/3 of the population, around 18 million, would be killed in the first few minutes of an all-out attack. But civil defense volunteers were trained to deal with the aftermath.
We'd go right through from arriving at the scene to rescuing them, treating, giving first aid, removing them to casualty centres, and then they would be categorised and moved on, either dead or needing further treatment.
A dramatized version of an attack came in a film made for showing on BBC television in 1965.
Time, 9:13 a.m. This family couldn't afford to build themselves a refuge. This could be the way the last 2 minutes of peace in Britain would look. 9:16 a.m. A single megaton nuclear missile overshoots Manston Airfield in Kent and airbursts 6 miles from this position. At this distance, the heat wave is sufficient to cause melting of the upturned eyeball, 3rd-degree burning of the skin.
The war game was banned, shown for 20 years. The authorities called it alarmist and bad for morale. In the government's own information films, underground control rooms handled attacks calmly on Battle of Britain lines. They showed officials tracking radioactive fallout and evacuating whole cities in an orderly fashion.
Oh, you've had the fallout warning. Should be due any time now. Here it is. Papa 1, fallout, 1528.
I think we all thought we were going to save the world. Initially, I mean, after some time and watching films and seeing the increase of the power of the bomb as the years went on, I think we realised that there'd be nobody who'd be surviving. And these civil defence exercises do us no good at all, because we'd all be dead.
But despite the official precautions, the public came to learn that just testing weapons had dangers too. American H-bombs were fired on remote atolls in the Pacific.
The survey aircraft carefully searched the area and reported no shipping. The shot was fired. The wind failed to follow the predictions, but shifted south of that line. A Japanese fishing trawler appears to have been missed by the search, but based on a statement attributed to her skipper, to the effect that he saw the flash of the explosion and heard the concussion 6 minutes later, it must have been well within the danger area.
The Lucky Dragon was out fishing when the Americans let off their largest H-bomb ever in 1954. Matashichi Oishi was on deck.
My face, and this is the side the ashes hit, came out in rashes and small blisters. Then after a week I started to lose my hair. Hair would stick to the comb in clumps when we combed it. Our hair was falling out.
The 23 fishermen all developed radiation sickness. One died. Their experience provoked an outcry in Japan, where the extent of the long-term injuries to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims was only now emerging. Those stories had been suppressed immediately after the war. Demonstrators called on the Western powers to stop the Pacific tests.
Like a man-made sun, the fireball glows high above the Pacific Ocean. A signal to the world that Great Britain is now a top-ranking power of this nuclear age.
After the first British H-bomb test in 1957, an entirely new type of popular protest emerged, and it showed the real extent of public fears.
This business of hydrogen bombs and nuclear weapons is supremely a moral issue. I believe myself that the crime and that this march to Boston, it's an event in the course
Some
of
government
the
politicians called the campaign subversive, but the organizers made their position clear in their own film, narrated by Richard Burton.
When politicians fail, people must give the lead. Not people of one class or age or country, for this is everybody's cause. Yes, these were ordinary people, not frivolous or eccentric, but ordinary people with a point of view.
Well, I feel that this is a question of survival. There's no question of hitting back. It's purely on the basis of survival. If we have another atomic war of this kind, it's the finish for Britain. And I personally feel that it's time the people of Britain realise that. When they realise that it's compromise or death, and I think they'll make a real effort to solve the question of the H-bomb.
And as part of the youth in England who are going to live in the future, I felt it was my responsibility to take part in any sort of demonstration which would help stop warfare. And that's why I've come here.
We felt that we united everybody under our banner, that it avoided party divisions, it avoided class divisions, it avoided age division, and here we were for the first time, a united country behind one very simple idea. And it was a wonderful feeling of excitement and moving forward and a better world. I don't remember feeling it was particularly radical, but it was just an excitement of something new that everybody had to believe in because it was so obviously right.
The march to the weapons factory at Aldermaston was reported round the world. It challenged the secrecy surrounding the nuclear program and showed the gap between political leaders and grassroots feeling.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
In 1963, the three countries who'd made the bomb first agreed to stop tests in the atmosphere. But tests continued nevertheless, as more nations joined the nuclear club in a rapid proliferation. France was there by 1960, China by 1964. 10 years later, India, Pakistan, Israel, South Africa were all working on secret bomb programs. China achieved the H-bomb in 1967.
This is a gigantic success of Mao Zedong's thought. This is a gigantic success of the General Line. Long live the Chinese Communist Party. Long live Chairman Mao.
But the propaganda battle had another side, as nations competed in their claims to be using atoms for peace. More and more power stations were commissioned.
Many years ago, our first knowledge of atomic energy came from a horrible explosion of a bomb that killed hundreds of thousands of people. No one imagined at the time that the atom would one day start working for people. This happened in the Soviet Union at the first nuclear-fueled power station not far from Moscow.
The Soviets built 13 power stations in 8 years. They were close to major towns, Lenin, Chernobyl near Kiev, and Leningrad.
The Lenin nuclear power station in Leningrad. Each of its 4 turbines has a 1 million kilowatt capacity. All the equipment is Soviet-made. The station is absolutely safe for personnel and for nearby residents. This is where the power workers live. No dust, no smog, no soot, and a powerful nuclear power station nearby.
In the West, a trusting public accepted that nuclear power could take over from other fuels.
Formed in the deep recesses eons ago, our oil is being consumed at a heart-sickening rate. We must develop more natural resources. The nation needs more nuclear power plants. Reactors have proven to be safe, reliable, economical.
Taxpayers were persuaded that investment in the nuclear future was essential. Billions of pounds were spent building power stations. By 1980, 260 reactors were in service in 24 countries. And billions more were still being spent on the nuclear arms race. Each side now had thousands of missiles waiting to be fired at each other's cities from deep silos. Each new system was more complex than the last. But as the costs rose and the Cold War thawed, the superpowers saw they had to call a halt. In 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed an arms reduction treaty.
Our peoples, for too long, have been both the masters and the captives of a deadly arms race. This situation is not preordained and not part of some inevitable course of history.
While politicians had tried to do something about the fear of nuclear war, people had growing concerns about the nuclear peace. Fears that the power stations could leak radiation grew after the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. A generation was less willing to believe the experts. In the West, each new project was opposed, though scientists continued to say the fears were unfounded. The East allowed no demonstrations, but it was there that the nuclear age had to go critical. The Chernobyl reactor was 60 miles from Kiev. Most of its workers lived in the town of Pripyat, half a mile from the plant, which supplied electricity to much of the Western Soviet Union. In April 1986, the accident they'd been told was impossible happened. An explosion blew the roof off the main reactor and a major emergency began. A helicopter pilot saw what they all feared most.
Центральный зал блока номер 4. Включи! Выше! Держи это место! Держи! Держи! Где дым идет? Где дым? Вот так держи!
The orange glow led scientists to think a reactor meltdown was underway, the so-called China syndrome. The Soviet government tried to hush the incident up. In a desperate race against time, engineers worked to put out the fire and discover what was happening at the heart of the reactor. They cut a hole through the 10-foot concrete lining. And one person had to do the most dangerous job of all, go right underneath the reactor and see if the radioactive core was burning through. Veniamin Pryanichnikov volunteered. When he climbed through, he didn't know what he'd find.
When I pulled open the cover, I felt something pouring on my head. All I was wearing was a thin protective cap. I immediately knew I was in a catastrophic situation. and I was probably finished. I shouted to the people who were with me to hand me the meter so I could measure the radiation intensity and know how long I had to live, 1 day or 2. The meter showed about 200 units, maybe 250, but no more than that. It was then I realized that I was all right. I was alive.
Though the meltdown hadn't happened, there had been a massive leak of radiation. A complete evacuation of a 20-mile zone round Chernobyl was ordered.
Внимание, внимание! Уважаемые товарищи, в связи с аварией на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции в городе Припяти складывается неблагоприятная радиационная обстановка. Сегодня, 27 апреля, начиная с 14:00 часов, возникает необходимость провести временную эвакуацию жителей города в близлежащие населенные пункты Киевской области.
As the families went out, young army conscripts were brought in to help clear up. With no special protective clothing available, they had to improvise. The level of radioactivity was so great that each man would be allowed to work for a single 2-minute period. They'd have to rush in and rush out. Up on the reactor roof, they had to clear the highly radioactive debris blown out of the core. Valery Starodumov led the operation.
The
previous group of soldiers had removed a piece of graphite from the reactor, under which they found part of one of the fuel rods. This semicircular fragment had to be picked up and thrown away. Here it is. The soldier is carrying it along with other debris and is going to dump it over the edge. All this rubble on the ground is left over from the explosion of the reactor's graphite core. The soldiers are having to walk over these radioactive bricks. It's clear it was everyone's duty to reduce the dangers after the explosion. I'm the father of 2, and I knew that the accident was particularly risky for our children because of the long-term consequences. The longer we left it to deal with this time bomb, the more unpredictable those consequences were going to be.
Pripyat was sealed off and left a ghost town. Western scientists said their reactors were safer, but few were now prepared to believe them. Altogether, 600,000 people were contaminated by Chernobyl. Radioactive dust drifted over Western Europe. And the question no one could answer was what would happen in the long run. At the start of the nuclear age, no one knew what the long-term effects would be. The learning curve was costly. In the United States, many of the soldiers exposed to the desert tests developed radiation diseases. The assurances given to St. George that the fallout was harmless also proved wrong. Sheldon Johnson, the former GI who thought his life had been saved by the Hiroshima bomb, brought up a family and had a second son.
The first time it really hit me really strongly was when, in 1954, we had a Down syndrome son born to us, and we were very young parents. We found lots of others with the same situation. And that can be that, wait a minute, for a small, we have an enormous number of children with mental retardation of all various genetic defects born around 1954. Why? You know, it really come quite forceful then. What was different about 1954? Well, Dirty Harry was one.
The Japanese had the greatest first-hand experience of what both an atomic explosion and radiation could do to people. Sumiteru Taniguchi, the boy from Hiroshima, was still being treated for his burns in 1996.
My wounds weren't properly treated until 1960. That was 15 years later. It wasn't easy. Then I developed a tumor where the skin had burnt, and the doctors told me it was cancer. The war ended 49 years ago, but not for us. We victims have been suffering ever since, and we don't know how it's going to affect future generations.
In the 1990s, all governments had to set the strength of popular feeling against the long-term need for electricity. Almost all Western countries stopped ordering nuclear power stations after Chernobyl. But despite passionate opposition, the Japanese government continued its nuclear program and opened a new fast breeder reactor. "50 years after the war, Japan had 49 nuclear power stations, producing a third of its power. Experts said there was no other way to provide for the people's needs. And the people still had no way of knowing if they could trust them.